This is Vanessa Gorman. Now that you recognize subordinate clauses in English, let's talk about how we do them in Greek. And in particular, the ones that take the indicative mood, since that's the only mood you know so far. There are 6 types of clauses that take the indicative mood that you're going to see on a regular basis, and we're going to leave the relative alone for now because it is a different type of clause. And we're going to go through each of these other 5 in turn and show you examples of them and how to make trees out of them. So we'll begin with temporal clauses, which are by far the most common clauses in Greek and very, very easy to translate. And we've already talked about a lot of ways of expressing time. So you can use a preposition like metata tauta. You can use adverbs of time, now, then, afterwards. You can use accusative neuter adjectives, especially husteron or proteron or things like that. You can use oblique cases of nouns to express time when in the case of dative, genitive of time within which, and accusative of extent of time. So we've done all of these already. Another way of expressing time we're going to explore later is using a participle. But today we're going to talk about subordinate temporal clauses. Now, all subordinate clauses are introduced by subordinating conjunctions. So these are all subordinating conjunctions. Hote, heos, mekri, epe, epede, hos, and prin. These all introduce temporal clauses. They are indeclinable, so they're always look the same. They are always labeled as auxi. Their relationship is always auxi. Their part of speech is conjunction, the same as the word and or but or, but the relation label is always different. Temporal clauses can refer to a single action in the past that takes the indicative mood. Does take the simple imperfect or aorist and are negated by oo or ook. So the subordinating conjunction is always labeled auxi. Its part of speech is always labeled conjunction. The verb of the clause is hung on that subordinating conjunction. And the verb is labeled according to what the clause is doing in the larger sentence. The remaining elements are labeled as normal. So you can hang the entire subordinate clause as a separate tree and then move that over to the coordinating conjunction, and then all you have to change is the main verb. It's not unusual for verbs to be elided. I just want to warn you that, although I'll try not to give you too many examples of that at the moment. So when they came, they called an assembly. The main sentence is they called an assembly. That's your independent clause. But when they came, so when is labeled as a conjunction, its relation is auxi, and it hangs on the main verb. Unless they are acting as attributes or attributes of a noun or adverbs on another adverb, subordinate clauses usually hang on the main verb. So, and in this case, it's just giving you another adverbial idea, which is when this is happening. And so it's labeled as an adverb. The main sentence here, Agamemnon made a sacrifice there when he sailed to Troy. So again, it's just giving us some additional adverbial information not necessary to the argument of the verb. Here's a little redundancy, which we see not unusually in Greek. Ekbino, bino is the March word, to ek is out of, so to disembark is the idea of that verb. So he did not disembark from the ships before. So we've got this before word here, proteron, and then the idea is kind of repeated in the prin, before they came. They seemingly other ships or something in the feminine. So we've got a redundancy, which is just fine. You can have as many adverbs on a verb as you want. So he did not disembark from the ships before they came. Pharnabazus went into, this is epibino, to go in, um, on his horse into the sea. So there's your main sentence. He went into the sea. Mekri ein dunaton, as far as or until it was possible, right? So this is going to be a neuter noun acting as a predicate nominative. And so this is actually not a temporal clause, but it's structured like a temporal clause. So I wanted to show you, you can stretch some of these into the spatial sense. So as far as it was possible. Now, causal clauses are pretty straightforward as well. If they indicate a fact, then they take the indicative introduced by either hoti or epe, because, now epe usually means when, but you can sometimes, when, the temporal idea when can sometimes overlap with a causal idea. And so it's sometimes a little vague, just like language is sometimes a little vague. So here you got the main sentence. These cities were a gift. They were a gift to Gongolus. So the dative of possession with gift is labeled as an attribute from the king. There's your main sentence. Why? Because he alone of the Eritreans fled. So he's the only one that came over to the king from the Eritreans. So it's explaining the cause. So hoti is simply just because here. Now, causal clauses can be translated because or since. You can say as, although I'd prefer you didn't, because it as does too many other things. You want your reader to be able to understand it on the first take, and because is not ambiguous. Since can have that sense of time or cause, and sometimes you want that ambiguity, so there you go. They approved. That's the main verb here. They approved. Why? Because they were doing nothing wrong now, right? They were doing no harm now. Okay, the next type of clause are comparison clauses, and these aren't always straightforward comparison, but they have this sense of as introduced by the word hos again. Now we've seen genitive of comparison that happens quite often. We've seen genitive of comparison by itself or with a or malon a, and we sometimes see the dative there as well. And we see dative of degree difference. But what we're going to have here is hos or hosper, which is the same word just strengthened, plus the indicative meaning as or just as. So it's not necessarily a straightforward comparison in the same way, although it can be. Often preceded by hutos, meaning thus, just as. So, or some form like that. So they did these things. That's your main sentence. They did these things just as he ordered, in the way that he ordered. So it's kind of a how. And so it's labeled as an adverb. They appointed the council and other offices. That's a straightforward sentence. Hos edoke autois. Now this we see a lot. As it seemed best to them. The way it made sense to them. And that also is technically a comparison clause. It's giving us the how. You see these quite a lot, often in set phrases like hos edoke autois or something of the nature. Now, substantive clauses can also take hos or hoti, words we've already seen, but they're pretty obvious as a rule because certain verbs take a substantive clause instead of an object. Now, remember, these are just things that act the part of a noun, usually just translated that, and after certain kinds of verbs, like verbs of emotion. You rejoice that, you grieve that, you wonder that. And also after impersonal verbs, after verbs of emotion, it's going to be the object. After impersonal verbs, it is clear that we would say in English, but that the substantive clause there is going to act like the subject. That the sun is shining is clear. You also get it as an object after verbs of saying, knowing, perceiving, showing. So here we have a case of he remembered, or sorry, they remembered. They were remembering. What are they remembering? Well, here the author has been so kind as to give us two different kinds of subordinate clauses. They were remembering that they had ripped the offerings from the altar, and that they did not go to war in accompaniment with Agesilaus into Asia. So they're remembering two things, and these are the direct objects of what they're remembering of the main verb, but they're expressed in the form of subordinate clauses, and so they act as objects. The hos and the hoti are still labeled as auxes because that's what we always do with the actual coordinator or the subordinator. It's coordinated, so the verbs down here are object cos. And then the rest of the sentence is labeled as you would any normal sentence. The object of the verb of the clause, an adverbial preposition phrase. He understood that much grain was to them. Much grain existed for them, dative of possession, and he was besieging them. So again, he understood that. It requires a substantive clause acting as the object. So again, they're pretty straightforward as a rule. They're often the same words we use in English that way. And if you're wondering if a clause is the object of a verb, look it up in the LSJ and see what structure is used with it. Conditional sentences. There's a couple of kinds of conditional sentences that take the indicative. So remember, these are if-then statements. The if is called the protasis, and the then is called the apodosis, and that's the independent clause. And it uses different moods depending on how likely the condition's fulfillment is. So if Persia invades again, then we will not be able to defend ourselves. It's pretty much a statement of fact. If it were to rain, I would have to delay my departure is not so much. And if he had departed on time, he would be here by now is also less likely. Now, simple conditionals, as they're called, state something with no implication of its reality. It's just a simple fact. If it rains, I get wet. If it rained, I got wet. It's just a statement of fact, right? You express it with the word a, meaning if, the indicative in the protasis and the indicative in the appositive. And so you translate the word a as if, and you translate the rest like a normal sentence. There are also things called unreal or contrary to fact conditionals, which state a supposition that cannot be realized because it's not true. We know it's not true. So if it were raining, I would be getting wet. So it's stating a reality in one sense, but it's actually contrary to a known fact. This is expressed the same way as the simple, except that you add the word on to the apodosis. So again, a plus the indicative plus on. On is that untranslatable, indeclinable word that simply adds a potentiality. So might is the sense of it. It adds that in a potential sense. It's a wonderful little word because it tells you right away how to translate something. So here's an example. Lysander collected all the other ships. If anyone was there, that shouldn't be a pronoun, that should be an adverb. If anyone existed. So this is just telling you a condition under which he's collecting the other ships. Pretty simple. If he thought these things from the beginning, indeed, he was an enemy. He was an enemy. But mentoi here has to be a coordinator because we don't have anything else, and it can occasionally act as the coordinator, the men. he would not be thought justly to be a scoundrel. So just because you're an enemy, you can still have honor, is the sense of that, right? So if he thought these things, now this protasis applies to both halves of the apodosis. So we hang it on the coordinator and not on the verb of the first half of the sentence. If it just applied to that verb, you would hang it on there. Then we get sentences like this, which are impersonal. The main sentence is this then is clear. This is clear. But again, it's a kind of a redundancy. What is clear? The fact that this is not a comparison, by the way. This is just a clause I want to talk about. It's a kind of a substantive clause, so I should have talked about it earlier. The fact that the battle was near the wall is clear. So tauta, this, and the hoti clause represent the exact same thing. So I've used the comma as a positive, and they're both the positive. We've had to supply a main verb, estin. So this, the fact that the battle was near the wall are the same thing, subject apps, is clear. So this sentence has required a little work, but it tells you it's a construction that you see quite often in Greek, and so I don't want you to be scared away by it. It's pretty straightforward. I've given you this handout for this chapter, which lists all the subordinating conjunctions we've talked about thus far, gives you a meaning. Whether they're labeled conjunction, I'd like to point out that several of them, mekri and hos, can both also be prepositions. And hos can also be an adverb. It's kind of a multi-purpose word. We'll talk about that more when we get to participles. And the type of clauses they're typically used for. Now, below the solid line, I've given you some words that we haven't quite got to yet, but I thought I'd put it all in one handout. On, meaning the sense of potentiality. We have used that so far, and that's labeled as part of speech as an adverb, and it's always an aux y. It's a type of sentence adverb, quite common. There's also a different negation we use when something is more potential, and that's may, which is used in place of oo or ook. And also can be the lead in to a clause if it's a negative fearing clause, especially. I fear lest something is going to happen. Instead of using hoti, they use may as the coordinating or subordinating conjunction. And may days can replace udes in these subordinate clauses where may would be used for negation where something is not real. Maydays is this no one, just like udes is no one, and it's declined the same. So those are things we'll see more of later, but I'm putting them all together on this one handout for you.